Have you ever noticed how genuinely good people seem to suffer more than everyone else? Those who act without malice, who give without expecting anything in return, who carry a compassion that seems to come from somewhere else. And why, despite all that purity, does the world treat them as naive, weak, disposable? It's not a coincidence. There's a deep psychic structure operating here, something most people will never notice. Authentic goodness, when it doesn't integrate one's own internal abysses, isn't virtue. It's a psychological trap that transforms saints into unconscious martyrs. And the worst part, you might be trapped in it right now thinking you're noble, when you're really just running away from facing who you really are underneath that mask of light. Carl Jung spent decades studying why good people fall apart. He discovered that goodness, when lived in a one-sided way, without balancing the shadow aspects of the psyche, isn't wisdom. It's archetypal possession. The archetype of the saint, the healer, the innocent lives in the collective unconscious of all humanity. It's a powerful magnetic image. But Jung warned, when you identify completely with an archetype, when your entire personality molds itself around being the good person, you stop being human. You become a character. And characters don't have depth, don't have roots, don't have ground. The first gust of wind knocks everything down. The problem isn't goodness itself, it's living only half of who you are, denying the other half that exists, pulsing, waiting to be recognized. Because that denied half doesn't disappear. It grows in the dark, gains strength, and eventually collects its price. Think about someone you know who's genuinely good. I'm not talking about the person who performs goodness on social media, who posts about empathy but is cruel behind the scenes. I'm talking about someone who really acts without calculation, without expecting applause. That person, deep down, carries a weight that nobody sees, because authentic goodness isn't a social mask. Jung called these masks persona, the face we show the world to be accepted. The persona is necessary, it's part of social navigation. But there are people who use goodness as persona, performing compassion to belong, to be loved, to hide the internal emptiness. And there are those who are good because they simply don't know how to be any other way. The difference is in the origin. The persona comes from fear of rejection. Authentic goodness comes from something deeper, almost involuntary, that often the person themselves can't explain. And here's the first brutal paradox. The world can't tell the difference. To society, authentic goodness and performative goodness look the same. So they treat both the same way, with the same distrust, the same veiled contempt. Because deep down, nobody truly believes that someone can be good without wanting something in return. Now comes the part that hurts. Jung spent his life studying what he called the shadow. The shadow is everything you repress, deny, push under the rug of consciousness, because it doesn't fit the image you've built of yourself. For the person who sees themselves as good, the shadow is enormous. It contains all the aggression you never expressed, all the selfishness you suffocated, all the anger you swallowed while smiling. Every capacity for manipulation, cruelty, revenge that you have but pretend doesn't exist. And the more you identify as someone good, the more you reject these aspects, the bigger the shadow gets. It's psychic mathematics. You push into the unconscious everything that contradicts your self-image, and that accumulates, takes on a life of its own, becomes an autonomous force inside you. And here's the first real paradox that few people notice. Extreme goodness doesn't eliminate evil. It just creates a proportional internal monster. You're not purer for denying your capacity to be cruel. You're just creating a psychological time bomb that's going to explode in ways you can't even imagine. And the worst part is that the world senses this. The people around you, even without knowing what the shadow is, sense that something's wrong. Jung explained that there's a collective unconscious, a layer of the psyche shared by all humanity, that contains the repressed aspects of the entire culture. And when someone appears being authentically good, without cynicism, without a hidden agenda, that person becomes a movie screen. Others start projecting onto them their own shadows, their own denied darkness. Have you seen this? Someone genuinely good entering an environment and, without doing anything, generating discomfort, inexplicable hostility. It's not simple envy. It's that your goodness reminds others of what they betrayed in themselves, of the purity they lost, of the compassion they buried to survive in a world that punishes vulnerability. So they attack. Not you, but the projection of everything they hate in themselves. You become the target of an invisible psychological war, where the crime was just existing differently. And the cruelest part? You don't even understand why you're getting hit. This projection dynamic operates at a level that ordinary consciousness can't reach. The people who attack you don't know why they do it. They make up reasons. They say you're fake, that you're acting superior, that you have hidden agendas. But deep down, at the unconscious level where truth lives, they're trying to destroy in you what they can't accept in themselves. The possibility of genuine goodness, of vulnerability without armor, of compassion without calculation. This threatens them because it exposes the choice they made to harden, to close off, to betray their own sensitivity so they wouldn't suffer. And now you show up, existing in another way, proving that it's possible to be different. That's not inspiration for them. It's a silent accusation. Your existence questions their choices. So they need to destroy you, reduce you, prove that you're not really good, just naive, weak, pathetic. Because if they prove that, they can keep sleeping peacefully in their own defenses. But if you're really authentic, if you really manage to be good without breaking, then they'll have to face that they gave up something precious. And that hurts too much to be endured. But there's a type of goodness that's even more dangerous. Jung identified autonomous patterns of behavior that he called complexes. They're psychic structures that take on a life of their own and dominate the person from the inside out. The savior complex is one of these. You know that person who lives trying to rescue others? Who sacrifices themselves compulsively for people who didn't even ask for help? Who feels an urgent need to fix everyone around them? That's not virtue. It's neurosis. It's a compulsive pattern that the person repeats without even noticing, because deep down, they're running away. Running from their own pain, their own emptiness, their own internal demons. Helping others is easier than facing yourself. Saving someone from depression is more comfortable than admitting your own. So you become a professional savior, driven not by the self, not by the integrated totality of who you are, but by the wounded ego desperately trying to feel useful, necessary, important. Jung was direct. This isn't virtue, it's psychological defense. It's the ego building an identity on top of a void. And the question you need to ask yourself now, without lying to yourself, does your goodness come from an authentic place, or is it just a sophisticated way of avoiding looking at the hole that exists inside you? There's more. When you identify too much with powerful archetypes like the hero, the saint, the wise one, Jung said you suffer what he called inflation. Inflation is when the ego, this fragile center of your consciousness, inflates beyond its own human limits. You start to feel special, different, misunderstood on an almost cosmic level. Very good people frequently suffer unconscious inflation. They don't realize it, but they start seeing themselves as missionaries, bearers of some light that others don't have, chosen for something greater. And Jung warned, every inflation precedes a catastrophic fall. Because you're not special. You're human, mediocre in several areas, flawed, limited like anyone else. True humility doesn't come from putting yourself down. It comes from recognizing your own mediocrity and darkness with brutal honesty. From admitting that you have the capacity for horrible things, that your goodness doesn't make you superior, just different. But the inflated ego doesn't accept this. It needs to feel elevated. And when reality shows that you're just one more person trying to survive, the collapse is inevitable. And what happens when your goodness isn't recognized? When you offer genuine compassion and get spit back in return? Jung understood that this generates a deep narcissistic wound, not in the pathological sense of narcissism, but in the structural sense. The psyche suffers trauma when the image you have of yourself is destroyed by external reality. For someone who built their entire identity around being good, rejection isn't just social. It's ontological. It questions your entire existence. If I'm good and I'm still rejected, used, discarded, then what's left of me? The ego that rose on virtue crumbles, and you're there, without ground, without identity, not knowing who you are when goodness no longer works as armor. This wound hits the self, which Jung saw as the core of identity, the totality of the psyche. And when the self is hit, the person doesn't know who they are anymore. They enter an existential void that can last years, because they never prepared for the possibility that being good wouldn't be enough, that the world spit on the only thing they thought had value. If you're enjoying this content, check out in the first comment our exclusive ebook, Alchemy and Archetypes. Relationships are another minefield. Jung developed the concepts of anima and animus, the internal images of the feminine and masculine that each person carries inside themselves. When these internal aspects are wounded, the person projects unrealistic expectations onto external partners. And you know who attracts these projections like a magnet? The good person. Because those with wounded anima or animus look for someone to save them, to complete them, to be the ideal they never reached. They project onto the good person the redemption they seek. But Jung was clear. Relationships based on projection inevitably crumble when the projection is withdrawn. And it always withdraws, because nobody can sustain the weight of being another human being's emotional savior for very long. So the good person enters relationships where they're put on an impossible pedestal, then destroyed when they can't maintain the fantasy. They attract those seeking external redemption, not real partnership, and this condemns the relationship to failure from the start. The pattern repeats: meet someone broken, try to help, get idealized, disappoint, get discarded. And in the end, they're left wondering why they always choose wrong, without realizing it's not choice, it's projection. They're magnetically attracting the unintegrated shadows of others, and the cycle is addictive in a cruel way. Because in the beginning, being idealized is intoxicating. Someone finally sees all your value, all your goodness, all your light. You feel recognized for the first time. The problem is that it's not you being seen. It's the projection. It's the fantasy the other person created. And you, desperate for real connection after so long being misunderstood, grab onto that fantasy too. Start performing the idealized version the other expects. Contort yourself to fit the image of savior. And the more you do this, the further you get from who you really are. Until one day you fail. Show fatigue, vulnerability, humanity. And the projection collapses. The person who idealized you now sees you as the biggest disappointment, punishes you for not being the god they imagined. And you're there, exhausted, betrayed, not understanding that the entire relationship was built on an illusion from day one. Jung warned, don't accept being idealized. Because the fall is inevitable, and the higher the pedestal, the more brutal the impact when you fall. There's a brutal difference between conscious sacrifice and unconscious sacrifice. Jung made a point of marking this. Conscious sacrifice is choice. It comes from an individuated self, from someone who knows themselves and decides to give up something for a clear reason, conscious, aligned with their deep values. Unconscious sacrifice is neurotic compulsion. It's when you sacrifice yourself because you can't not do it, because some psychic pattern forces you, because some wounded part of you believes your value comes from nullifying yourself for others. Many good people live in perpetual unconscious sacrifice. They dodge their own needs, ignore their own limits, empty themselves to fill others. And they think that's virtue. But Jung was direct. Suffering without consciousness doesn't transform anything, it's just suffering. Unconscious martyrdom doesn't generate alchemical work, doesn't produce philosophical gold, doesn't create anything of real value. It generates only ash. Because you're burning yourself without reason, without true purpose, just obeying a psychological script you don't even know is running. And in the end, you look back and see an entire life of sacrifices nobody asked for, nobody values. That led nowhere. Just a tired body and an empty soul. Jung said something scary. The individuation process naturally isolates. Individuation is becoming who you really are, not who society wants you to be. It's following the self, not the collective. And whoever does this walks alone. The authentically good person, who didn't mold themselves to social conventions, who didn't learn to play power games, who didn't develop the cynical shell that protects most people, experiences a deep ontological loneliness. It's not the loneliness of not having people around. It's existential loneliness of not belonging, of being in a world, but not being of that world, of speaking a language others don't understand. And the hardest thing to accept, this loneliness isn't a defect. It's a natural consequence of authenticity. The price of being who you really are, of not betraying your deep nature to fit in, is not belonging. Jung knew this. Whoever follows the path of individuation doesn't have crowds. They have, at best, a few who recognize the same journey. But most people? They'll look at you like an alien. And it will hurt, because humans are social animals. We need tribe. But the tribe of the individuated person isn't geographic or cultural. It's spiritual, rare, scattered. And while you haven't found it, if you ever find it, you walk alone. But what happens when you take goodness to the absolute extreme, without integrating the dark side? Jung studied a principle he called enantiodromia, borrowed from Heraclitus. Enantiodromia is the conversion of something into its opposite when taken to the limit. It's a psychic law, a compensatory force that the psyche uses to balance itself. And Jung observed this countless times. Excessive goodness, without shadow integration, without balance, eventually explodes into its opposite. Saints who get sick with psychosomatic diseases. Pacifists who explode in uncontrollable rage. Martyrs who manipulate others through their own suffering, using pain as an emotional weapon. The psyche seeks balance. If you don't consciously integrate opposites, it forces balance unconsciously, often destructively. You deny your own aggression for years, until it erupts in a fit of rage that destroys a relationship. You nullify yourself for others compulsively, until one day you wake up hating everyone and distance yourself from everyone brutally. Enantiodromia doesn't ask if you're ready. It happens when the imbalance becomes unsustainable. And the good person, who never learned to integrate their own cruelty consciously, is caught by surprise when they discover themselves capable of things they swore they'd never do. This moment of conversion is terrifying, because it collapses everything you thought you knew about yourself. The person who never raised their voice explodes and screams. The person who always forgave suddenly becomes relentless. The person who lived for others cuts, ties brutally and without remorse. And then comes crushing guilt, total confusion. How was I capable of that? I'm not like that, but you are. You always were. The difference is that now the shadow took over, because you ignored it for too long. Jung saw this as necessary psychic adjustment, but painful. The psyche can't stand perpetual imbalance. If you only live in one pole, it throws you to the other with force proportional to the time you resisted. And the more you cling to the image of good person, the more violent the fall when enantiodromia happens. Because you fall from a height you yourself built, brick by brick of denial and repression. Jung incorporated terms from alchemy because he saw deep parallels between the transformation of metals and the transformation of the psyche. One of these terms is nigredo, the black phase, putrefaction, death. In alchemy, it's when matter decomposes completely before being purified. In the psyche, it's the death of the ego. It's deep depression, existential collapse, the dark night of the soul. And the genuinely good person eventually faces the nigredo, when goodness doesn't work anymore, when they're betrayed by those they helped, when they sacrificed everything and received nothing, when the world showed that no matter how pure you are, you can still be destroyed. Jung saw the nigredo as a necessary phase of real transformation. The death of the innocent ego, of the ego that believed goodness was enough, prepares the birth of a conscious ego, integrated, more complex. But without guidance, without understanding the process, the nigredo can be just destruction. The person sinks into depression, despair, bitter cynicism, and never gets out. Because they don't understand that this is necessary death, not the end. That the old self needs to die for a new self to be born. That real psychological transformation always goes through the complete decomposition of what you thought you were. But nobody talks about this. So the person gets stuck in the nigredo, rotting, thinking life is over, without realizing they're just in the darkest phase of a larger process. The way out, according to Jung, is in shadow integration. And this doesn't mean becoming evil. It means consciously recognizing your capacity for selfishness, cruelty, manipulation, and choosing not to act on it, but without denying it. It's looking at your own darkness and saying, yes, this is also me. I'm capable of hurting. I'm capable of being cold. I'm capable of thinking only of myself. These capacities exist. And now that I know they exist, I can consciously choose when to use them and when not to. Mature goodness isn't absence of evil. It's conscious choice, despite capacity. It's much easier to be good when you don't even know you have the capacity to be cruel. That's innocence, not virtue. True virtue is being good after knowing your own darkness deeply, after having visited your own abysses, your darkest impulses, your capacity for destruction, and still choosing compassion. But choosing with discernment, not with naivety. Choosing knowing exactly what you're giving up by not acting through the shadow. This goodness has weight, has density. It's not empty light. It's light that knew darkness and decided to shine anyway. Jung differentiated ego and self in a crucial way. The ego is the center of consciousness, the part of you that thinks I. The self is the psychic totality, including conscious and unconscious ego and shadow. Everything. The self is bigger, deeper, wiser than the ego. And here's the difference. The ego that decides to be good is operating from an immature, superficial place. It's trying to build identity, seek validation, mold itself into an acceptable image. But the self that expresses goodness naturally is operating from an integrated place, from someone who already made the inner journey, and goodness simply emanates as a consequence of who the person became. The question isn't, should I be good? It's, does my goodness come from the wounded ego wanting approval or from the integrated self expressing its nature? True virtue isn't forced moral decision. It's natural expression of who you became after crossing your own darkness and emerging whole. It's not performance, it's emanation. And you feel the difference. Ego goodness is tense, needs recognition, breaks when not valued. Self-goodness is tranquil, doesn't need applause, sustains itself alone because it doesn't come from external seeking. It comes from internal fullness. True goodness, in the Jungian view with alchemical touches, is the opus of a lifetime. Opus is the work of internal alchemy. It's the gradual integration of light and shadow, conscious and unconscious, ego and self. It's not the initial state of innocence, it's the final conquest of someone who crossed their own darkness and emerged whole. This goodness has something that naive goodness never has. Healthy boundaries. It knows when to say no. It doesn't sacrifice itself compulsively because it understands that destroying yourself doesn't help anyone. It has discernment, can see when someone wants real help or just wants to drain energy. It has compassion, but compassion that doesn't self-destruct, because it knows its own abysses and respects them. Knows that if it ignores its own darkness, it will explode in uncontrollable ways. So it honors both sides. Feeds the light, but recognizes the shadow. Chooses goodness, but doesn't deny capacity for cruelty. And from this integration is born something Jung would call philosophical gold. Not purity, conscious totality. A whole person, not fragmented. Capable of deep goodness, because they also integrated the depth of what isn't good. And this integration, this balance between opposites, is what makes goodness sustainable, wise, real. So the paradox of being a good person isn't just social. It's psychological, structural, archetypal. You suffer not because the world is unfair, though it is. You suffer because you're living only half of yourself. Because you repress the shadow thinking it made you better, when in reality it only made you more vulnerable. Because you built identity on top of virtue without realizing that virtue, without integration of your own demons, is a castle of sand. Because you attracted projections you couldn't sustain, entered sacrifices you didn't consciously choose, inflated yourself beyond your own human limits, and then collapsed when reality collected the price. Jung isn't saying you should stop being good. He's saying you should be good in an integrated, conscious, whole way. For you to know your own darkness as well as you know your light. For you to choose goodness with your eyes open, knowing exactly what you're doing and why. Because only then does goodness survive. Only then does it not become unconscious martyrdom. Only then can you be genuinely compassionate without destroying yourself in the process. And if you made it this far, if something in these words touched deep, maybe it's because you recognized your own journey. Maybe you're that good person who suffered without understanding why, who gave everything and received crumbs, who was misunderstood, rejected, exploited, and now you have a choice. You can continue in the same pattern, repeating the same mistakes, hoping that one day the world will recognize your virtue. Or you can start the real journey of integration. You can look at your own shadow without fear, recognize your darkest capacities, and consciously choose what to do with them. You can transform naive goodness into wise goodness. You can stop sacrificing yourself compulsively and start acting from a place of fullness. You can let the wounded ego die and allow the integrated self to be born. It won't be easy. Jung said individuation is the most difficult task a human being can face, but it's also the only one worth it, because in the end, you won't become less good. You'll become whole. And goodness that comes from someone whole has power that fragmented goodness will never have.